everybody. Welcome to Frontline Dispatches, a program of organizing upgrade where we talk about left struggle and victories and lessons learned for our movement. My name is Xiomara Corpeño. I'm actually covering for Jayanni Webster today, and we are interviewing Yotam Marom, who is one of the organizers of Occupy, originally in New York, and we're so excited to welcome him to our show. Hi, Yotam. How are you? Great to have you.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm good. Thanks.
Great.
How are you?
Great. Well, this is a 10-year anniversary of the movement to Occupy Wall Street. It's a pretty exciting time. And when I was looking back at some of the materials, reading your article and other articles to get ready for today's show, I was astounded about it's been 10 years. It feels longer, and it feels like we've had so many wonderful movement moments since then. And I would like to say that it's thanks to Occupy that we've been able to do that. So I'd love to hear a little bit about you. You're a leader at Occupy Wall Street. You've also founded other organizations. First start off by telling us, why did you join Occupy in New York, and what was that about? What was happening at the time?
Well, I joined Occupy kind of before it started. I was part of some of those assemblies that were happening. I guess there's a kind of a bit of a through line of things that were happening in New York City that were related to Occupy, kind of in a build-up. So there had been a protest called On May 12th, which was organized by community organizations, labor unions. Like, it was a real kind of cross section, and the slogan was, make the banks pay and tax the rich and stuff like that. And I had been doing student organizing at the New School, and there was a student occupation and whatever. There's kind of like, there were a series of student occupations that the year before leading up to that summer, NYU, the New School, a few others. And I found myself in the mix in this, planning this big march that ended up being like a 20,000 person march. And the end of it was the beginning of a thing called Bloombergville, which I helped organize, which was basically like a street occupation for 2 weeks to try to stop the budget cuts. There were massive budget cuts being rammed through New York City by Bloomberg, like cuts to really everything, like schools, firehouses. I mean, just like across the board, healthcare. And we did this like very scrappy occupation, this like kind of, it was awesome to be there in some ways, and a really formative moment and educational and all that, but also not super successful, and the budget cuts passed. And the end of that was in some ways the beginning of Occupy, because some of those debrief meetings were conversations about, okay, there's this call being put out about September 17th. What do we think about it? And then other people started organizing around that September 17th call, and then things sort of like merged, and there were these assemblies. So I had kind of been around and kind of running around the New York left.
Yeah, I really love that. In your article, you quote, in the previous weeks I had been to planning assemblies, but I didn't take them very seriously. And I crack up at that because in your article, you do talk about sort of the element of surprise and wonderfulness and beyond imagination. And it actually reminds me of when we had the mega marches for immigrant rights in 2006 here in Los Angeles and across the country. And even though on March 25th, we had more than 500,000 people in the street, as we got ready for May Day, I was going through the motions, and I was just kind of like, yeah, sure. And then we had over 1 million people, and we shut down the city. And so I love those beautiful moments that, we can have, and then talking about that. So I'd like to talk to you about, I love that you provide some context, because Occupy didn't come out of nothing, right? There was organizers who've been doing work for democracy, anti-fascism, but also around what later became known as like the 1% versus the 99%. What was the initial goal of Occupy, getting together at the park, at Zuccotti Park?
Well, I mean, I think that's probably one of the things that Occupy is famous for, is that we didn't really have goals. I think everybody there would have told you a different answer to that question. I think the tactic was actually one of the things that focused people. It was like, we're going to go there and we're going to be there and we're going to stay there was a pretty driving force. And then there were a lot of things that made it what it was, like the slogan of the 99% and the focus on Wall Street and the sort of emphasis on direct action and the like the centrality of some version of participatory democracy and all these kinds of things. But we didn't have demands. Nobody had any idea how it was going to go or when it was going to end or how it would be gauged to be successful or not. And those are some of the things that made it special, and also some of the things that killed it. I mean, the things that don't have a vision of success have, a life expectancy to them. So, so it's complicated to say what the goal was. Like,
yeah, I appreciate that. In my formation as an organizer here in Los Angeles with Anthony Thigpen, we talk about, like, to make social change, you need three major shifts in power relationships, in infrastructure, and then narrative. And I feel like Occupy hit all of those, even though there wasn't like a campaign demand. In terms of narrative, it really just changed the way that people thought about like what country we're living in and people suffering and pain coming out of the recession. And then I think in terms of like infrastructure, it's, we're going to occupy this space, so that was like the power and infrastructure. And that in itself was revolutionary, right? Because usually it's like, this is a private park, you need to get out. And that was actually a lot. I remember hearing a lot of like the mainstream media talking about, well, this is a private park. And activists saying, well, forget that. That's not what this is about. So I think that's beautiful. It doesn't have to have like an end goal, but it did shift, I think, dramatically how people were thinking.
I think so too. I mean, I think that's probably, that resonates for me, I think. And out of those three, I think, what Occupy did best was create a narrative shift, was like open people up to something new and sort of change the story of what America is or what's possible in this country. And, about austerity, about capitalism, about class, things that really just were not part of a mainstream narrative until then and are now, kind of taken for granted. And then I think there's another thing about infrastructure, which is that it led to the development of a lot of movement infrastructure afterwards, which I think was accidental and, a sort of like natural outgrowth of the end of a movement moment, is that people who are seasoned in that moment and politicized and moved and transformed go off to do things. And some of those things are building new institutions, and whether they're organizations or media outlets or parties or whatever that then become left infrastructure. I think a lot of that happened after Occupy, and I think that's part of why we've had more sort of social movement moments and social movement organizations in the past 10 years than maybe in the 10 years before that.
Yeah. I want to remind our viewers who are with us live on Facebook and YouTube to drop your comments or questions in the chat, and we will answer them. And actually following up on this, we'll get to like what kind of has come out of Occupy 10 years later, but I think it's also important what came out in that moment. I mean, even I was just reading back articles, by October 15th or less than a month after the occupation took place, we had at least 15 cities, at least that mainstream media was aware of, but you saw all around the country, right? From Albuquerque to Detroit to Tennessee. So were those occupations or those Occupy movements, were those coordinated with New York, or did those come out more spontaneously?
A bit of both. I mean, I think, one of the things that's really fascinating about Occupy Wall Street and movement moments in general is that they eventually, I mean, if they're successful, they get to a point where they've gone to scale. And when they go to scale, they kind of become out of control. And there are things about that are scary and unfortunate and, often unstrategic. And there are also things about that are like magical. And so what happened when Occupy went to scale was that there was too much going on for anybody to run it. And so people would go there. I mean, in New York, it happened a certain way where people would show up at the occupation and spend a little bit of time there and then find a place for themselves. And in many cases, what they would do is they would find a need that was unmet for them personally or for people who they cared about, and then meet that need. Like, well, I'm here and like not a lot is going on and I don't feel good in my body. So like I'll run a yoga class, or, the start a library, or I'll open an assembly for folks of color to talk about what they're experiencing here or whatever, And the same thing happened nationally. So people were like, well, I live in, some other place and there's no occupation here, so I'll start an occupation. And and that was met by people in New York and elsewhere who were like, well, I'm good at helping things network. Let's help start other occupations and coordinate and support them and teach them how we did things. And so there were people doing that. I wasn't one of the people doing that, but there were people doing that, and there were people doing things on their own, and sometimes those things met in the middle and sometimes they didn't.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about in terms of people of color. There's been a critique, and I think it was more back then than now, but in terms of the reading that I did recently around the anniversary, but there was a critique that like there was a lack of like racial politics coming in. And how did you all address that in New York?
Well, I mean, there was like a pretty bustling people of color caucus that went through a ton of process and then also put the other, segments of the occupation through process as well. And that resulted in probably a bunch of things that we wouldn't even know, like ways that like documents that were written were reshaped and things like that. And I think also, yeah, of course, there was a fundamental, I don't know if problem, but like reality of like who was at the center of that moment and who was driving it. And yeah, it was a real, I mean, I guess in some ways it was obviously a problem, and in other ways it was just what it is. And there were other things that were happening at the time that made that a particularly complicated moment. For example, there wasn't, a lot of the sort of like what we come to think of as the kind of like national Black left of today didn't exist at that time. Not to say that there wasn't a Black left, like there have been Black organizers doing revolutionary things since before this country was born. And also, this sort of like organizations like Dream Defenders and networks like Black Lives Matter and Movement for Black Lives and Blackbird and like all this infrastructure that now exists didn't exist at that time, which meant that, and I mean, from my perspective coming into sort of like, from the perspective, I think of a lot of us in that moment, Occupy was kind of a rupture for the movement too, that it was like where the action was, and there weren't that many other places where we felt like there was action. So there's a lot of pressure then on this place to be the thing that holds all things.
Yeah.
And that's not going to happen. Like nothing can hold all the things, And so I think there was something in there that couldn't have been fixed. And
yeah, and organizing upgrade, like I think there's different factions in the left, and so kind of where we're coming from is really like we have to address those things, and there's and those need to be led by BIPOC communities, and so I see that as like an Occupy in terms, because we did have Occupy Harlem, the Occupy in Detroit, even in Albuquerque, it was called Unoccupy Albuquerque, which is really a nod to in terms of like we're on a colonial settler state. And so I think that there was a lot of growth coming out of that for folks to take leadership. I remember Rinku Sen wrote a paper about it too. It's just like this is not just a white movement, and there's other people who are involved and who have been part of the left for a long time. And as you said too, I believe one of the organizers, and I can't remember her name, but actually was one of the organizer of Occupy, and then became one of the co-founders of Dream Defenders. Right, so people came out of this movement, and
that was Nalini Stamp. Yeah, I mean there were a lot of people of color and who really were driving in New York too. I think the same structures that fuck up the rest of society fuck up our movements too, and so I think and there wasn't a system for accountability or for leadership in any way. And that's one of the things that Occupy failed at, was creating systems of accountability. And in some ways that that hurt, people of historically oppressed groups or marginalized groups, whether they're people of color or women or queer folks. But it also just kind of screwed everybody. Like, when we pretend that there are no leaders, it means that you can't hold leaders accountable, and it means you can't train new leaders, and you can't, there's just a million things that go wrong when that happens. And so, that's one of the things that went wrong. And also, a lot of people of color shaped that thing, fought for it, and fought inside of it to become a better space, made it what it was. And in some ways, I think this is very much, probably within the politics of Frontline and organizing Upgrade, is like, you can't, class and race in this country are not separable. Maybe they are conceptually, but not in this country and not in this reality. Right. So if you're going to be a movement of the 99% and it's going to be led by white people, then that's a severe limitation on how far that movement's going to be able to travel.
Right. Yeah, but I think Occupied helped open up that space to have that conversation, for sure. Totally. I don't think that, at least for me explicitly, I'm trying to remember, I had just had my first kid. My kid was 2 years old. We actually had a work trip to New York. So I took me and my dad and his girlfriend and my baby. And it was just like exciting, you know, and even though there was the critiques, et cetera, I was just like, oh, I think this piece too around like, we can create our own, right? Which to me, like even in this COVID moment and looking at mutual aid, networks that sprouted up that are not necessarily attached to a nonprofit or organization, but it's like, okay, we're going to come together and figure this out. Like I like that. Like that piece really speaks to me about Occupy. And I feel like I learned a lot during that moment around that.
Same. Just the infectiousness of that like freedom to just go and create. It's impressive. It's big. Yeah.
I want to remind our viewers, if you have any questions or comments, please drop them in the chat in YouTube or on Facebook. And Yotam, I'm wondering what, let's talk about the successes. What are the things that you're seeing now in movement work that you're like, that started in Occupy, or that's something like an extension or evolved from Occupy? Are there moments like that you can connect with, that connect us with like that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't know that Occupy like invented any of these things, but certainly it was a really forceful. It was like a political force that re-injected a set of things into the public again and into the left, and those things were like a focus on class, which was sorely missing, and I think you can trace that to Bernie and and like a whole bunch of other things that have happened since then, and the DSA and so on. A focus on direct action, which I think we've seen that play out in a bunch of other movement moments: Indigenous, Black folks, immigrant, and again, not that Occupy invented direct action, because there were direct action movements even in the decade leading up, but there was something about, there's like a new generation of movement people that were minted in that moment, and then took those skills and took those politics elsewhere, and then probably a bunch of other things.
What do you think? Like, so I want to get on that point in terms of like a new generation. So there's folks, I had been doing direct action work. You had been doing that already. There was already, but this attracted a lot more people who didn't call themselves activists, didn't see themselves as activists. What do you think attracted them to come?
I think a combination of things. I think, like a good materialist will say the conditions, right? Like it's got to be something that has to do with the conditions, right? So like the foreclosure crisis had happened, people were like pissed off. I think at the same time, there's something happening in politics where the sort of political generation I grew up in, I was politicized under Bush Jr. I'm maybe a little bit younger than you, and like Bush Jr., the wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, Haiti, that kind of thing was like what sort of flung me into the movement. And there's a very particular like darkness to that period of time. Like we were just really outmatched, and like the movement did not have a lot going for it, and there were massive protests against the wars, and the wars just continued unflinchingly. I mean, it was just like a really fucking depressing time to be in the movement. I think that's probably more similar to the decade or two just before than to the decade or two after, which is politicized under Obama. Like hope and change, and like this, maybe we can win something, and but also he betrayed us, all these kind of complicated feelings that I think politicize all, so you've also got that happening at the same time as like the material conditions and this sort of like political change, and then a bunch of random shit that like you can't really account for. Like the particular moment and the language of I think some of the stuff that happened in the couple of months just before Occupy in the same city that looked not that different, just had slightly different slogans, and this one was just a little bit less. It was just like a little bit more pissed off and a little bit more irreverent and a little bit more fuck you and a little less like thoughtful, and that just seemed to click. And you can't really account for all that. I think also some things about the structure of Occupy drew people. Like what you're talking about, this sort of when you go there and you see people just doing, as opposed to asking permission or as opposed to organizing or being organized, all of which have an important place in movement building. And in my day-to-day life, I'm not usually like an anarchist running around in the street doing whatever the fuck I want. But there is something just like, mind-blowing about that feeling, and I think it resonated for people.
Yeah.
And
I it's interesting too, because like we just did the 20-year commemoration of 9/11 coming out of New York. I thought for me that was also a moment, because when 9/11 happened, a lot of the immigrant rights work just got put under national security. And I remember the morning of 9/11, I called up my boss at the time. He was organizing director of where I worked. And I said, what's going to happen to us? And it did really feel like, people were just being targeted as enemies as a state. And so for me personally, coming into like understanding that this was happening in New York City, which was totally over policed and over militarized, that was also really motivating and freeing as well, because we had been like, all the actions, and you talk about this in your article too. I want to read this quote. It says, I often find myself yearning for something fiercer and angrier, something authentic and less calculated, less thoughtful. And then you talk about, just like we have all these, yes, we have a direct action, and we have the list of people who are going to be part of the direct action. Did everybody get the training? And do we have, which is great because we want to keep people safe. But there's that moment where it just bursts open as a movement. That's so exciting. Right. And then we've seen that with Black Lives Matter, obviously, as well. I mean, those are like, I feel like kind of the prime moments.
Yeah.
I think the Black Lives, the movement for Black Lives, generally across the country sort of has, in terms of some of the similar characteristics that you say, like once it's a movement, then people make it their own. And, local chapters, they're not necessarily affiliated. There's kind of general demands, right? And really for Black Lives Matter, it's about valuing Black life in this country and acknowledging where it comes from. And so, a lot of people, say like, people's like, how could the movement absorb people into organizations for long-term struggle? So, coming out of Occupy, and here we are 10 years later, what do you have to say about that? And is that question too narrow?
The question being, how do we absorb people from these movement moments into long-term struggle?
Yeah. And or organizations.
Yeah, there are a lot of people out there trying to figure that out. And, the folks who I'm sure a lot of you know about momentum trainings, and a lot of the organizations that have come out of that, like Sunrise and It's Not Now, and a few others. And, I think the theory is basically that people respond to movement moments, and they need to be integrated into some kind of organizational infrastructure through like training and work and ongoing work that then produces new momentum, that brings new people in who get absorbed in through training and then put into work and then produce more momentum. I think there's a lot of questions about how that actually works. And I think I have questions about just what's reasonable to expect of the public outside of movement moments. Like, if you look at it, if you look like at history, revolutions happen. They don't happen that often. They happen when humongous numbers of people decide to stop following the rules, and the vast majority of those people are not part of organizations, and not before and not after. And that just might be what it is. I think the question is like, how are we creating moments that and supporting people to step into moments or responding to moments in a way that's actually like constructive and supportive. And also, I think we've got other problems in this country, which is like we have a labor movement that's been like eviscerated over time, and a basic sort of like social safety net that doesn't really exist. There's other countries, there are people who are like part of social clubs, and what the Black church used to be, like sort of infrastructure that becomes movement infrastructure when in those movement modes, and we have very little of that. So I think there's a lot of work that we need to do to basically like rebuild a basic foundation, and then build a bunch of social movement organizations and the labor movement that can trigger movement moments and move people towards them. But I think the expectation that everybody gets absorbed and organized that's not going to happen. I think we need to create ways for people to move into action and in and out of action.
Yeah. Well, as we're wrapping up, I'd like to just let you get the last word in terms of what advice do you have? Like, I tend to be a little negative, or just kind of get caught up and like, oh God, we've done this before. Like, should we keep doing it? But yet here I am, right? Even though I'm an eternal optimist, even though I spew out a lot of negativity or like what didn't work. But what advice do you have for activists moving forward, whether it's folks who just got recently activated in the last year, after the killing of George Floyd, or people who've been in the movement for a while, like ourselves? Like, what advice do you have in terms of like keeping kind of that momentum and fire going, despite the ebbs and flows of our movement?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'm in the same boat as you, where I look at the writing on the wall and I'm like, we're pretty fucked. And, we've got some really titanic problems. We're on a pretty tight timeline for fixing them, and our movement is mostly not in the position to do what it needs to do on a pretty short timeline. That's like the reality check. And then, I think my advice is, look, we just don't know. We just don't know what's possible, and we don't know what works and what doesn't work. And I've learned that lesson a lot of times. I learned it at Occupy, when I went there and thought, this is dumb and it's not going to work, and then it worked. And I also learned it other times, like, during the protests after George Floyd's murder, like, you couldn't, in New York, in Brooklyn, like, you couldn't step out of the house and not bump into a protest. And it was weeks of this. I mean, it was like a movement town all of a sudden. And that was happening in places all over the country. And that never felt possible to me, that we would be blocking traffic and people weren't pissed off that the traffic was being blocked. They were proud to have their car blocked by this protest, and they were honking in support. Yeah. Like, I've never seen that. And I didn't imagine that was possible in this country at this time, given the history of white supremacy, on this land, and it happened, not that we won, and not that it was everything we needed it to be, and none of that, but just, hey, and I think sometimes about, the old cartoon, the Roadrunner cartoon. So he's always like running away from Wile E. Coyote, right? It's a coyote.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Destroy him in the most violent way. It's a very violent show. Anyway, this guy, the coyote comes up with a new way to try to catch the Roadrunner every time.
Yeah.
And then like a little glitch happens each time, and it doesn't work. And I just want to be like, listen, dude, just try the same thing again. Like, don't invent a whole new rocket ship. Like, just do the same thing again. What are the odds that it's going to keep glitching every time? Eventually it's going to work, right? Just like,
right.
Keep on this Roadrunner, you're going to get him. Like,
right. Right. Well, I want to appreciate that. That's great advice. I think like now too that a lot of left organizations and movements are embracing the electoral politics. That's the lesson learned out of that too, right? We got to keep trying. We got.
Yeah, you're not supposed to win all the races. You just need to run. We just need to run more races. You know
Right.
what I mean? Like.
Great. Well, thank you. That's all the time we have. I appreciate you making the time to write the article, give us your reflections, and also do this interview today. And we put it on the chat for anybody who wants to read it. Thank you so much for joining us today. And for our viewers, I want to say thank you for joining us today. And we'll see you next week at 4 p.m. Pacific time, and that's 7 p.m. Eastern time.
Thanks for having me.
Take care. Bye.